We got it. Baruch Hashem. Good morning to everyone. Okay, we have a few new students.
Yes,
You
my
are?
name is Nadia.
Nadia, nice to meet you. Where are you from?
I'm from Brooklyn.
From Brooklyn.
Yes.
But I detect some kind of an accent.
I traveled around the world. I was born in Azerbaijan,
Oh, okay.
and I moved to Israel when I was young. Then I moved to United States,
Oh,
and now I'm here.
okay, good. And you are also new.
I am new.
What is your name?
Nechama.
Nechama. Where are you from, Nechama?
Iowa.
From Iowa. Ooh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, good morning.
One second. Iowa. Is that where they have a shchita there?
Yeah.
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 Okay.
Why does everyone know this?
Yeah, it's very well known. It's one of the biggest shchita in America is in Iowa. Yeah, or as we Moroccains say, Iowa.
For sure. Yeah.
Okay. All right, we're going to get started. This week's parasha is Emor, and it has probably one of the most important positive and negative commandments in the Torah. Before we get to that, I mean, as the source sheet actually already says, but before we get to that, so the parasha begins. So the first two chapters of the parasha really deal with laws that have to do with the Kohanim, okay, with the priests. It talks about when they are allowed to be. So a Kohen is not allowed to become tameh, right? At least not purposefully. Right, so there are many laws that pertain to tumah. So obviously one of the main ways of tumah is what's called tumat met, right? A person who comes in contact with the dead. So a kohen is not allowed to become defiled. The parasha goes into the exceptions to the rule. In other words, who is he allowed to become defiled for in what's called a met mitzvah? Anyway, I'm not going to go into all of those laws. Okay, it also talks about who a kohen can marry, who he cannot marry. It talks about the laws of the kohen gadol. It talks about many laws of what invalidates a kohen, right? Many types of mumim that invalidate a kohen. That's the first chapter. Then we go into the second chapter, which is Kaf Bet, right? And it continues the theme of the kohanim. It talks about korbanot. It goes into the laws of trumot and masrot, safeguarding them, and so on. So the first two chapters of the parasha deal with kohanim, and then we get to a very interesting and ambiguous pasuk. Does everybody have a source sheet over there?
Yes.
Okay, so if you look at source number 1 on your source sheet, we get this pasuk which, right, it seems to not belong. In other words, we've been talking about Kohanim up to now for a good 2 chapters, and then all of a sudden the parasha kind of shifts gears over here, and it says like this: Ushmartem mitzvotai, you shall keep my commandments, vasitem otam, and you shall do them. Ani Hashem, I am God. Velo techalelu et shem kodshi, and you shall not. So lechalel, by the way, the word lechalel means to profane, but what is the shorish of the word lechalel?
Halal.
What?
Halal.
Halal. Okay, halal or chol. Right, chol. Right. In other words, what does chol mean? To be mundane. Okay, profane is worse. Right. Mundane is actually, I think, a more parav kind of, right. But don't profane my name. Right. Velo techalelu et shem kodshi. V'nikdashti betoch bnei Yisrael. Rather, I shall be sanctified amongst the Jewish people. Ani Hashem mekadishchem. I am God who sanctifies you. So there's a big question. So there's 2 mitzvahs here, okay? There's 2 mitzvot here. One of them is a positive commandment, which is sanctify my name. This is what we call Kiddush Hashem. And then the other one is a negative commandment, which is don't profane my name, which is Chilul Hashem. Right? So I would probably say that these are like 2 really, if, we're not allowed to choose. I don't know if I ever gave you my class on, are we allowed to choose mitzvot? Right? Are we allowed to do that? So we're really not supposed to do that, right? But I think that everyone would agree that if we had to put a hierarchy, at least of what we think is the importance of mitzvot, because we don't know what the importance of mitzvot is, only Hashem does, right? But if we had to put a hierarchy to it, I think we would all say these are 2 biggies. right? In other words, from the positive point of view, what sanctifying God's name, and from the negative point of view, God forbid, to profane, to desecrate Hashem's name. Okay, now, by the way, there's a couple of interesting questions over here. So, first of all, what is this doing here? We've been talking about Kohanim up to now. We've been giving all these like technical laws, who the Kohanim can become impure for, right? What invalidates a Kohen, on and on and on and on. We have this whole section. Then all of a sudden, in the middle of nowhere, the Parsha throws in the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem, the mitzvah of Chilul Hashem. Like, who are we talking to here? That's number one. The other part of it is it's interesting that when it says over here about profaning God, it says, V'lo techalelu et shem Kodshi. Let's just think really carefully over here. It could have just said V'lo techalelu, right? Et Hashem. Don't profane God, right? What does it say over here? Don't profane God's name, right? What is the meaning of Lo techalu et Shem Kodshi? All right, so this is a big question, and I'm going to try to give three answers to exactly what is this referring to? In other words, who is it talking to over here? And how exactly is Kiddush Hashem? How exactly is Chilul Hashem? These are biggies, okay? So let's start with the Ibn Ezra. Okay, the Ibn Ezra says the following. I put it for you in English. I mean, I should have probably given it to you in Hebrew and in English as well. I'm sorry for that. But the Ibn Ezra says, by the way, the Ibn Ezra was very logical. Right? When the Ibn Ezra tries to understand a text, he's very, very logical. So remember before I said, it's talking about Kohanim, and then all of a sudden, out of nowhere, we have the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem. Comes along the Ibn Ezra, and he says, no. He says it's not out of the blue. Listen to what the Ibn Ezra says in number 2. And you shall not profane my holy name. This is directed to the sons of Aharon, for this section is connected to what is stated earlier. Right? In other words, comes along the Ibn Ezra, and he says, you know who the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem and Chilul Hashem, at least in the context over here, is talking about? It's talking about Kohanim. Okay, by the way, any daughters of Kohanim over here? Okay, what?
Bella.
Bella?
Yeah.
What do you mean Bella?
Remember Bella?
She's a daughter of a Kohen. Okay, beseder. So, in other words, this mitzvah is not talking to any of us. That's what the Ibn Ezra says. The Ibn Ezra says that this mitzvah is talking about the Kohanim. The Kohanim have an obligation to sanctify God's name. The Kohanim also have a prohibition not to sanctify Hashem's name. What's the proof of the Ibn Ezra? Very simple. The proof of the Ibn Ezra is the juxtaposition. We've been talking about Kohanim all the way up to now. So obviously, if now we have a pasuk that follows all the laws of the Kohanim, then it's got to be talking to the Kohanim. Okay, very logical. By the way, if you just look at source number 3, right, this is the way Perek Kaf Aleph, one of the first psukim of Kaf Aleph, the parasha says, Kedoshim yu leElohehem, you shall be holy to God. This is talking to the Kohanim. Okay, so what does the Torah say to the Kohanim? You shall be holy to God. V'lo yichalelu et Shem Elohem, and you shall not desecrate God's name. So it's already been told to the Kohanim at the beginning. So the Ibn Ezra says the continuation is just the same idea. Ki etishe Hashem lechem Elohem. Anyway, this is the Ibn Ezra. What's the problem with the Ibn Ezra? The problem with the Ibn Ezra is, hold on a sec, what? We're chopped liver. I mean, only the Kohanim can mekadesh Shem Hashem. Only the Kohanim are warned not to desecrate Hashem's name, right? I mean, why would we limit the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem just to Kohanim? Are they the only ones that can sanctify God's name? Yeah, go ahead.
What does it mean when you say chopped liver?
When I say chopped liver, it means like what? I mean, we're not important. Only the Kohanim are important? I'm sorry. Only the Kohanim are important. Only they can do Kiddush Hashem. Why would we come to such a conclusion? Again, the Ibn Ezra has a good argument, and that is that there's a juxtaposition there. But from a philosophical point of view, this is a little bit difficult. Right? So let's have a look, because not everybody agrees, and here is the Rambam. The Rambam in Mishneh Torah says the following. it is mandatory upon the whole house of Israel. I think I put that in bold for you. In other words, all of Am Yisrael. It's not a mitzvah just for the Kohanim. It's a mitzvah on every single Jew. It's mandatory upon the whole house of Israel to sanctify this great name. For it is said, and I shall be sanctified amongst the children of Israel. And by the way, what is the Rambam source? That every Jew is obligated to sanctify Hashem's name? Our pasuk. Right? He quotes from Vayikra chapter 22. Right? So in other words, he understood this pasuk completely different than the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra says it's only talking to the Kohanim. Comes along the Rambam and he says, Ma pitom. Every Jew is obligated to sanctify Hashem's name. So he says they are also charged not to blaspheme him, for it says, and you shall not profane my name. So according to the Rambam, every Jew is obligated to sanctify Hashem, and every Jew is prohibited from profaning Hashem, from desecrating Hashem's name. Okay? Let's just have a look and see how do we do this. All right? So in other words, now we have to try to understand what exactly does it mean to sanctify Hashem, or God forbid, not to profane Hashem's name. So let's have a look at Sefer HaChinuch in source number 5. The commandment to sanctify Hashem's name, that we were commanded to sanctify the name, as it is stated, and I will be sanctified in the midst of the children of Israel, meaning to say that we surrender our souls for the observance of the commandments of the religion. So, how does Sefer HaChinuch, how are you Mekadesh Shem Hashem according to Sefer HaChinuch? He says, meaning that we must surrender our souls for the observance of the commandments. That we have to be willing to die, right, in order to do the mitzvot. So how do we sanctify Hashem's name? If God forbid, a non-Jew would come and say, you are forbid. I forbid you from doing this, right? And a person says, no, I'm going to live by my religion. And the non-Jew says, well, I'm going to kill you if you do that. Right, so that's a good question. Says the Sefer HaChinuch, by giving up your life in order to live according to the Torah, says the Sefer HaChinuch, that's the way you sanctify Hashem's name. So every Jew that died for God's name, every Jew that sanctified Hashem's name by willing to die and not transgress, says the Sefer HaChinuch, that is Kiddush Hashem. Okay? That is Kiddush. We're just going to try to get some definitions here down, first of all.
That's the only definition of Kiddush Hashem?
Well, that's what the Sefer HaChinuch says. Why are you bothered by it?
Because Kiddush Hashem doesn't mean you have to necessarily die. You could do Kiddush Hashem when you're alive. Okay, you could do Kiddush Hashem when you're alive. Okay, let me rephrase your question. Okay, I'll rephrase your question, and that is, this is such an important mitzvah. I mean, again, if we had to do a hierarchy of mitzvot, and we would put Kiddush Hashem very high up, comes along the Sefer HaChinuch, and he says most Jews will never ever perform. I mean, I've never been in this situation. I hope, God forbid, I would want to be in such a situation, right? In other words, according to the Sefer HaChinuch, this is like such an important mitzvah. Yet most Jews never have a chance to do it. The only person who ever could do Kiddush Hashem is a person who, God forbid, is put into a dangerous situation where they have to give up their life for the Torah. Right? So how could such an important mitzvah be such that most Jews could never perform it? Right? At least that's the question if I'm just rephrasing your question. What? It's I don't know, I don't like it at all that you have to die for, because it says also if for your life, you're allowed to break the Torah and mitzvot. If I'm allowed to break Shabbat if it's
okay.
Life or death. So
okay, that's a good. So it's pikuach nefesh. Okay, so you're saying there's a contradiction. There's a contradiction. Something's not. I don't understand something here, and that is we have a very clear. By the way, that's source number 6. In source number 6, the Torah says, "Ushmartem et chukotai vet mishpatai." Right. This is just a few chapters. We just read this. You shall keep my statutes, my laws. Asher yaseh otam adam v'chai bahem. Right. The Torah says that you shall keep my mitzvot and live by them. So come along the commentaries, and they ask, what does it mean, v'chai bahem? So Chazal learn. I don't know if I gave you that source. Maybe I did. Anyway, Chazal tell us that you have to live by the Torah and not die by the Torah. So this is, in other words, what does that mean? You have to live by the Torah and not die by it. In other words, if you have a situation of pikuach nefesh, which you mentioned, then you desecrate the Torah. If the doctor tells you on Yom Kippur that you have to eat, you eat, right? You don't not eat on Yom Kippur, right? The Chazal tell us there's only 3 exceptions to the rule of pikuach nefesh. So in other words, all the mitzvot of the Torah, you have to vechai bahem, you shall live by them, right? However, there are 3 exceptions to the rule where you have to be willing to die, right? You have to be willing to die and not desecrate. What are those mitzvot? You should all know them already. Idolatry. Okay, so if a goy tells you, bow down to that idol or I kill you, God forbid, the halacha is you have to be willing to die. So idolatry. What else? Anybody else?
One of them is sexual immorality.
So adultery. Okay. If a person is put to that, they have to be willing to die and not commit adultery. And what is the other one? So idolatry, adultery, and murder. Okay? If a person says, kill that person or I kill you, so the Gemara says, you're not allowed to kill that person. You have to be willing to die. Who's to say that your blood is any redder than that person's blood? That's the way the Gemara says it. Okay? Who says that? In other words, everyone's blood is the same. So you have no right to take another person's life. So these are the only 3 exceptions to the rule. So by the way, we can understand the Sefer HaChinuch in the following way. What does it mean to be Mekadesh Shem Hashem? When a person is willing to die for those 3 mitzvot, then they sanctify God's name. Okay? Otherwise, all the other 610 mitzvot of the Torah, you desecrate. You don't have to, if you're put to a situation where it's your life or the mitzvah, Shabbat, whatever, right? There is an interesting discussion in the Gemara that if it's a time of Shema, but anyway, I won't go into that, okay? I won't go into that, but that's how we would reconcile the Sefer HaChinuch. Again, I have a problem with it, right? What's my problem with it? My problem with it is that according to that, we won't, how many people can perform the mitzvah of Kiddush Hashem? Mm-hmm. Okay, according to the Ibn Ezra, it's only Kohanim. Only Kohanim can do it. According to our explanation now, right, that Kiddush Hashem is only the 3 cardinal sins, I don't know, most people are never put to the test of those 3 sins, God forbid, right? So how are we to understand that? So therefore, I would like to give a 3rd answer to this question. Okay, a 3rd answer to this question, and maybe this gets to why it says, "Velo techalelu et Shem Hashem." You shall not desecrate God's name. So, who is the very first person? The very first person who speaks out in the name of God? Moshe?
No, Abraham.
Abraham, right? Avraham Avinu. It could be Moshe Rabbeinu as well, but I don't know if he's the first. Right? So there's a very interesting pasuk in Bereshit. Everybody look at source number 8. We skipped source number 7. Source number 7 is continuation of Sefer HaChinuch. In Perek Kaf Aleph, in chapter 21 of Bereshit, it says the following. This is a very interesting pasuk. It says that Avraham Avinu did the following. Vayita eshel bi'be'er sheva. Vayikra sham b'shem Hashem el olam. So Avraham Avinu plants a tree. He plants a tree. A tree is called, an eshel is called a tree. He plants a tree in Be'er Sheva. Vayikra sham, and there he calls out B'Shem Hashem, in the name of God. He calls out in the name of God. Avraham Avinu is the very first person in the history of the world who calls out in the name of God. Now, comes along Rashi. There's a very beautiful Rashi over here, just Pshat. And Rashi over here says something very, very beautiful. What does it mean that he calls out in the name of God? What does it mean? What does it mean to call out B'Shem Hashem? Vayikra Sham B'Shem Hashem. What did he do exactly? And what does it have to do with planting a tree in Be'er Sheva? Right? What is this eshel? Right? What is this eshel? By the way, the word eshel is an interesting one in modern Hebrew. Does anybody know what an eshel means in modern Hebrew? Yogurt. There isn't. It's called eshel, or eshel. That's right. It's called yogurt. By the way, there's a reason for that. What else is called not yogurt? I'm sorry, eshel in modern Hebrew. A hotel.
Eshel? Is it malon?
Beit malon, not a hotel, but a youth hostel. Like a youth hostel. A place of lodging. A place of lodging. Where do you get? Why? Because what do you get? What do you get in a youth hostel or in a hotel or whatever? If it's a good hotel, if it's a good youth, you get yogurt. You get food, right? You get food. In other words, you get a place to sleep. Get a place to sleep, and hopefully they'll give you a breakfast or whatever. You get food. Okay, maybe a yogurt. Okay, so listen to what Rashi says over here. Rashi says something very, very beautiful. Actually, I should have quoted to you in the Hebrew. I don't know why I put it in the English over here. I'm sorry. All right, so it says, Avram planted an eshel in Beersheba. Rav and Shmuel differ as to what this was. In other words, what exactly is this eshel? So says Rashi, one said it was an orchard from which to supply fruit for the guests at a meal. The other said it was an inn for lodging in which were all kinds of fruits. Right? So in other words, they both agree that the eshel was somehow Avram planted it, right, in order to do some kind of chesed, because Avram is chesed. One says it was a real tree that produced fruits, and now people could eat from the fruits. The other one says, no, an eshel is actually an inn. That's why I told you before that a youth hostel is called an eshel, right? By the way, that's why the word eshel, if you look at the word eshel, how do you spell it in Hebrew? Aleph, Shin, Lamed. So what is Aleph? Achila. Achila. Aleph stands for to eat, give you food. Shin, Shtiya, to drink. Right? I give you food, I give you to drink. And what's a Lamed? What? Lina. Lina means, did you say that? Thank you. Nechama, do you speak, are you a Hebrew speaker, Nechama?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. So Lina means to sleep. So that, by the way, that's why one of the opinions, that's why you have two opinions. One opinion says it was a tree that bore fruits, right? Achilan shtiya, because fruit, by the way, you can also use for shtiya. You take a orange, you squeeze it, you have orange juice, right? And the other one said it's lina, right? So Avraham Avinu plants an eshel, whichever one it is, whether it's food or whether it's a place to sleep. But then it says, Vayikra Sham b'Shem Hashem. There he calls out in the name of God. How exactly does he call out there in the name of God? Right? Through this eshel that he planted. So goes on Rashi and he says like this, there he invoked God's name. Through this eshel, the name of the Holy One, blessed be He, was called God of the entire universe. In other words, Avraham Avinu was the first Chabadnik, right? This is the first Chabad house, right? In other words, this is the first Beit Chabad. In other words, Avraham Avinu builds this little hotel. People can now come to the Pesach Seder, come for Shabbat, right? I'll give you to drink, I'll give you to eat, maybe I'll give you a place to sleep, right? But also, what else are you going to do over there? You're going to learn Torah. When I give you the apple, you're not just going to eat the apple, you're going to make a bracha on it, right? I mean, after all, that you're in a Beit Chabad, right? You're not going to just eat without making a bracha, right? So he says like this, through this eshel, the name of the Holy One, blessed be He, was called God the entire universe. For after they had eaten and drunk, He said to them, bless Him who of whose possession you have eaten. Do you think that you have eaten of what is mine? You have eaten that which belongs to Hashem, who spoke and the universe came into existence. So tells us Rashi over here something very beautiful. In other words, Avraham Avinu planted this tree to give fruit, and he also created this little hotel so that people would come. And then when they ate, he would tell them, you think you ate from my food? You didn't eat from my food. This food belongs to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? You have to make a bracha. Ve'achalta, v'savata, uberachta. You shall eat, you shall be satiated, now make a blessing. And this is the way Avraham Avinu brought people closer to HaKadosh Baruch Hu with this little action, the smallest little thing. Just to build a little place where people could come to, and then they would make brachot in the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And in this way, Avraham Avinu sanctified Hashem's name. That's what he did. He made God's name great. Right? He made HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name great. And by the way, we know that Avraham Avinu, that was his whole purpose in life. His whole purpose in life. Vet hanefesh asher asu becharan. It says that they made souls in Haran. And Rashi over there explains, what does it mean that they made souls in Haran? Avraham converted the men, and Sarah converted the women. What does it mean he converted them? Right? There was no Batei Din at that time. He brought them close to Hashem. He made them understand there is one God, and that's it. That's the only God that you should serve. All your idols are foolish, right? So Avraham Avinu teaches us a very beautiful lesson, and that is, how do you make God's name great? By the little things that you do to make Hashem known in the world. That's how you make Hashem's name great. Listen to what the Midrash says. He called out in source number 10. He called out in the name of God. This comes to teach that Avraham caused God's name to be proclaimed on the lips of every human being. So everything that you do, that now you make Hashem look good, says the Midrash over here, this is what Avraham Avinu did, you now are Mekadesh Shem Hashem. Right? He began to convert people to monotheism and to bring them under the shelter of God's presence. And now we have a really broad understanding of Kiddush Hashem. It's not only talking to Kohanim. It's not only talking to some person who's willing to, like you said, you had a problem with that, and I do too, right? Again, these are all valid answers. They're given by all the greats, the Rambam, the Ibn Ezra, don't get me wrong. But it could be that each one builds on the other. In other words, it's not just talking to the Kohanim. It's not just talking about a person who's willing to die for the name of God. It's talking about a person who's willing to live for the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, right? V'chai bahem. And that's a very powerful thing. In other words, that every single person, all the time, has the ability to Mikadesh Shem Hashem in the little things that you do. You're standing in line for a bus, right? And you let a person in front of you and you don't make a big scene out of it because you know you're doing a chesed for them and you have a kippah on your head or you look like a religious woman, right? So you made Hashem's name great, right? You make HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name great when you do that. Now just think about it. Think about how many times in the course of a day you have the ability to Mikadesh Shem Shamayim. How many times in a day? Right? I always say that, as religious Jews, we are God's ambassadors to the world. That's who we are. We're Hashem's ambassadors to the world, right? And we can do so many beautiful things all the time, and when we do it, B'Shem Hashem, we make HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name known in the world, right? And that's a very, very powerful thing. And by the way, the truth, it's also true, the converse is also true, right? We have to be so careful. In other words, if Kiddush Hashem is every little thing that you do to make God's name known in the world, whether it's letting someone take your seat on the bus, or I don't know, a million things that you could do, right? The converse is also true. We have to be so careful about what we do not to desecrate HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name, right? So if you lose your temper, right, when you shouldn't have lost your temper, or you should never lose your temper, okay? But there's so many things that we can do. I mean, how many times do we hear the fall? And sometimes it's not justified, but how many times do we hear the following? You say, oh, look at what that religious person did, right? So that's a terrible thing. We should try to stay away. We should try not to get ourselves into that situation, because then, unfortunately, HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name becomes desecrated, and that's called a Chilul Hashem. So we have this tremendous power. If you just stop and think about it for a moment, we have this tremendous power, like literally at the palm of our hands, of how we represent God in the world. Do we represent God in the world in the best way, or do we represent God in the world in a very, very negative way? And by the way, I have to say that in my experience, right, I've dealt with so many Balei Tshuva in my life, and I have to say the honest truth. Like most Balei Tshuva that I deal with, I ask them, what made you religious? Like, why did you all of a sudden decide that you wanted to become religious? Very few Balei Tshuva say to me, oh, they give me a whole philosophical argument of why they came to recognize God, right? It had to do with like some philosophical truth that they came to. Very few do that. I'm not saying that doesn't happen. Some people they're just seekers. They philosophically try to understand, is there really a God or not, right? But very few people say to me, that's why I became religious. You know what's the number one answer of why people tell me they become religious? I was at some family's house for Shabbat, and I just watched this family. I watched the way the husband and wife interact with each other. I watched the way their children respect them. I saw how this family behaves, and I said to myself, Ribono Shel Olam, I want to be like that. I want one day to be like that. That's who I want to be. In other words, something happened, not philosophically, right? But something happened that they saw the beauty of Torah. They saw the beauty of living a Torah way of life, that they said, that's what I want. That's what I want to be, right? So that's called. So just imagine that family. I don't know if, in other words, I'm just giving an example. But imagine that family who made such a beautiful. They just were such great ambassadors of Torah. Imagine that family when they get up to Shamayim. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not going to say to that family, okay, so you know what? I really want you to give me all the Yud Gimel Midot of the Rambam, and I want you to, I'm going to give you a test in Halakha to make sure that you go to Gan Eden, right? No, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to say, you know what? Do you know how many people became religious because they came to your Shabbat table? You have no idea. Right? Do you know what happened at your Shabbat? Do you know how you sanctified my name at your Shabbat table? Right? There's the door for Gan Eden. Go through it. Right? It's a very powerful thing, and so this is what we have the ability to do all the time. So, by the way, this is it's a tremendous zchut, but it's also a tremendous responsibility. Just think about the responsibility, right? That we what?
With responsibility, what is this?
With great power comes great
Yes, no, absolutely. And the Torah's power, and so we have a tremendous responsibility. It means that you have to be conscious all the time how you behave in public. You have to be conscious all the time, right? By the way, the Rambam, it's very interesting. I didn't quote it for you here. The Rambam tells us in Hilchot Deot, Hilchot Talmud Torah, I'm sorry. The Rambam explains what is a Talmid Chacham. What is a Talmid Chacham? So you know what? I'm going to throw it out to all of you. You tell me, what is a Torah scholar? If you had to define a Torah scholar, a Talmid Chacham, what would you say? Give me the qualities. I want to know what.
Obvious.
What?
One obvious.
What's obvious?
That he's in yeshiva learning.
Okay, he's in yeshiva. He's learning. You ask him a question in halacha, boom, he's got the answer for you right away. No? I mean, knowledge would for sure be one of the criteria for a Talmid Chacham. How could you be a Talmid Chacham if you don't have knowledge? Yeah, go ahead.
But I would say kind and knowledgeable.
Kind and knowledgeable.
Genuinely kind.
Okay, so midot.
Right.
So I want you to look up this Rambam. Okay, the Rambam defines what is a Talmid Chacham, and he doesn't mention knowledge. Maybe because it's obvious. Obviously, you can't be a Talmid Chacham if you don't know, if you don't know Torah. Obviously, right? But when the Rambam talks about a Talmid Chacham, you know what he says? He says a Talmid Chacham is a person who is kind to others. Einot soveach bashuk kemo behema. He says he's not a kind of person who yells in the marketplace like an animal, right? Ela shedvarav yu benachat im kol habriot. That rather he speaks softly and gently to everyone. He doesn't get angry. He danet chavero lekav zchut. The Rambam enumerates all of these things. He says he gives people the benefit of the doubt, right? It's crazy. In other words, the Rambam is defining what is a Talmid Chacham, and when he defines what a Talmid Chacham is, he talks about his character. He talks about his character traits first, right? By the way, it says, we say this every day in our tefillah, Talmidei Chachamim marbim shalom ba'olam. We say that every day in our tefillah. Torah scholars bring peace to the world through their actions. By the way, Rav Tzvi the Cook, right? I had the honor of learning in his yeshiva. I never learned from him, but people told me in his name that he would say that when it says Talmidei Chachamim marbim shalom ba'olam, the Torah scholars have to bring peace to the world. If you ever see a Torah scholar, if you ever see a person who's supposedly a Torah scholar who doesn't bring peace but brings machloket, it must mean they're not a Talmid Chacham. In other words, retroactively, it means they're not a Talmid Chacham. Maybe they know a lot, right? But see, the Torah is different in that the Torah is not just about knowledge. It's not just about knowledge. It's about who you are. The Torah has to change who you are as a person, has to make you better, has to make you a better person. If it doesn't make you a better person, then it's not Torah. You're misusing the Torah. I always remember I had the privilege, actually, I did have the privilege of studying with Nechama Leibovich many years ago. Don't know if you know who Nechama Leibovich is. She was probably one of the greatest scholars in Torah, in Tanakh, that I've ever known. She was amazing. She lived to almost 100 years old, and she was giving shiurim when she was like in her late 90s. Have you heard of Nechama Leibovich? Mm-hmm. Google her, okay? She was really an exceptional woman, and she just was a scholar in Tanakh. And she once told a very interesting story. So she taught all over the place, like she was everywhere. Like this woman, like literally was Marbitz Torah Barabim, like you've never seen before. She also taught a course at the Hebrew University. She taught a course at Hebrew University in Tanakh, and she told the following story. She told the story that there was a professor at Hebrew University, right down the hall from where she taught, who was teaching a course in ethics. In ethics, how to be ethical. She was very charif, and she said that this guy was rotten. He was just not a good human being. He was not a nice man. And she was like for the longest period of time, she couldn't understand how a person who is like not nice to others, doesn't speak nicely to others, is arrogant and has terrible midot, could be teaching a class in ethics. So one day she decided to confront him, and she was not afraid of anyone. So she went to him and she said, I don't understand. I'm going to tell you the honest truth. I don't like you. You're not a nice man. Okay, you're arrogant, this and that. How are you teaching a course in ethics? And this is the answer that he gave, and she made it was very beautiful. He said to her the following. He says, you know what? If you go further down the hallway, there's a professor who teaches mathematics, and he teaches about triangles. Is he a triangle? He's not a triangle. He teaches mathematics. That's it. I teach ethics. Doesn't mean it has to affect me. And of course she said that this is exactly the difference between Torah and between a secular subject. The secular subject, it doesn't have to change you. It doesn't have to do anything to you. Right? You can learn it, you could study it, you could teach it because it interests you. Because you like the intellectual, the intellectual challenge of it. But Torah is different. The Torah, you should be intellectually challenged by Torah. You should want to have knowledge. You should want to have all of these things. But if it doesn't change you and make you a better person, if it doesn't get into what I say, your kishkes, right? Then it's not Torah. It's not Torah. It has to do something to you, right? And so it's a tremendous responsibility. It's a huge responsibility. If we just get back to this idea of Kiddush Hashem, this is the great privilege, but the great responsibility that we all have. And that is that we can either make HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name great in the world, or God forbid, we can actually make HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name not great in the world. God forbid. We should never do such a thing. So the only way we do that is through our midot. The only way, I'm so much more impressed by good people than smart people. I am. When I was younger, I was impressed by people who were smart. I was. As I get older, I am less impressed by smart people, and I'm more impressed by good people. Now, I am very impressed by good people who are smart. Okay, so yeah, but so the two, they're not mutually exclusive of each other, right? They have to go together. But if I had to choose between the two, I would much rather choose between a good person than a smart person, right? And so this is and that's how we're Mikadesh Shem Shamayim. We are Mikadesh Shem Shamayim. We have to be very, very careful about that. Let me just share with you a Gemara in Masechet Yoma, source number 11. So we know that in the Shema it says, V'ahavta et Hashem Elokecha. It says in the Shema, V'ahavta Hashem Elokecha, the Gemara in Masechet Yoma says the following: the name of God should become beloved through your acts. This is exactly what we're talking about. In other words, God's name, through your actions, people should say, wow, if that's if that's the way the Torah makes you behave, right? That's amazing. I want to live like that. Okay? So the name of God should become beloved through your acts. When a person studies the Bible, in other words, the Torah, and Jewish law, and ministers to scholars, speaking softly with people, honest and honorable in his business dealings, what do they say of him? So what will people say about a good person, right? They say, this person who studied Torah, fortunate is his father, and his mother, I guess also, right? Fortunate is his father who taught him. Woe to people who have not studied Torah. Look at him, that Torah scholar, how pleasant, refined, and honest he acts. In other words, again, this is where the Rambam gets the idea that if you're a Torah scholar, you have to have these refined character traits. Right? So regarding this person, the Torah says, you are my servant Israel, in whom I will be glorified. This is a pasuk in Yeshayahu, right? In other words, Hashem becomes sanctified through our actions, because we're God's ambassadors. But a person who studies Torah and is not soft-spoken, honest and honorable, what do people say about that person? Woe to his father who taught him Torah. Fortunate are those who have not, fortunate are those have not studied Torah. Look at him, that Torah student. How unpleasant are his actions. How corrupt are his ways. This is the way. This is what the Bible refers to when it says, "They profane my holy name," from Yecheskel. So this is us. We have the ability to do this. We have the ability to either, right? And by the way, it's interesting that, when a person does sanctify HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name, who gets the credit for it? Hashem, their parents. Wow. Also their parents, right? Yay. In other words, Baruch, and that's why, I personally, I have to say I'm very, very lucky, because I had a mother and father who literally were exemplary. They were tremendous religious role models for me. My father was a shochet and a mohel and a sofer, right? Wow. Yeah, he was very, very busy. I always say my father was good with knives. He was very, very good. Yeah. But he was the most gentle person I think I ever met in my life. Gentle, unless you were a cow. If you were a cow, he was not gentle, right? Or an 8-year-old boy. But my father was he was a very gentle soul. What 8 day? He was a very gentle. Did I say 8 year? I'm sorry, I meant the 8 day. But my father, he was a very gentle. He was a very gentle soul, and it had a tremendous effect on me. It really did, right? When I saw my father, and my father, by the way, I could go on and on and on about my father, right? But he taught me so many beautiful things about how to love, Yiddishkeit. Like going to shul, going to shul for him was it was like, whoa, it was like he was in heaven, right? And by the way, he never ever came late. If he walked into the Beit Knesset even 1 minute late, his eyes were down looking at the ground. He wouldn't look at anybody. He was embarrassed. He was embarrassed to walk in late to Beit Knesset. So, it's important to have good role models. So yeah, if there's a person who sanctifies HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name, you know who we're going to give the credit to? His Abba and Ima. We're going to give to the Abba and Ima. We're going to give. That's why it's so important when we raise children. How important it is that we give them a very positive role model in this. In any case, yeah. So I think we have 3 different answers to this, and we can make HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name great by the things that we do. And when we do that, and we do it, and people know, oh, that person is a Jew. That person is a Jew, and look what they're doing, right? That's a tremendous Kiddush Hashem. Maybe I'll just end with a little story for all of you, because I just came back from 2 weeks. I was on March of the Living. I don't know if you know what March of the Living is. So March of the Living is 1 week in Poland through all the concentration camps and the ghettos and everything. And it's a very, very powerful trip. It's not for everybody. And honest truth, I don't think I'll ever do it again. It's just too much. But we went to Auschwitz, and we heard so many amazing stories. For me, obviously what happened in the Holocaust is horrible, and we just had Yom HaShoah. We had Yom HaShoah, and obviously it's terrible. And how could a people sink to such a low state of humanity? It's terrible. But for me, one of the tremendous lessons of the Holocaust is people who survived and the amazing stories of courage and bravery that took place. And that's something that we have to really appreciate. And when we were in Auschwitz, I heard this story that literally, I've heard a lot of stories in my life, Okay, but this story, like literally, I was like mamish. I had goosebumps. I was crying when I heard it, and we had a very, very good tour guide, a religious woman who was excellent, and she just made the whole thing really kind of come to life. And we got to the building in Auschwitz where, anyway, I'm sorry to mention his name, even Mengele did all the experiments, right? And they did terrible, terrible things. And she told the following story. So in Auschwitz, the men and the women were separated. They were separated, and there was a wall, and there was this man and this woman who, through the wall, there was a little hole in the wall. They didn't know each other. I forget their names. I could probably dig it up. But through the hole in the wall, whenever they had a little free time, they started to talk to one another. And over time, this was going on for months and months and months and months, and over time, they started to develop an affection for one another. They had not seen each other, right? They didn't know what each other looked like at all, right? Which is really quite remarkable, right? In other words,
standing against the wall with a hole next to them and go blah blah blah.
Yeah, they were just talking.
Ah.
No, they didn't see what each other looked like. There was no WhatsApp in those days. Nothing that they could, right? And they eventually fell in love. When the war was over, they survived, and they made they said, this is going to be our rendezvous point, and we're going to finally meet. They have no idea who am I meeting? What do they look like? Obviously, when two people want to get married, obviously, by the way, the halacha is you're not allowed to see your kala. You have to see her. She has to look good for you, right? In other words, and him too as well, right? So they hadn't seen each other, but that didn't matter because they were there was something much deeper. Anyway, he turns to her. And he says right on the spot there, he says, I want to marry you. And she says, no, I can't marry you, right? And so he's shocked. He doesn't understand it. He insists. And she says, I can't marry you. So he says, tell me why. So he tells her, because I can't give you children. And I don't want to do that to you. He says, what do you mean? How do you know that you can't give me children? So he says, because I was one of the people who was in Mengele's place in the experiments, and it happened that in that building there was a Jewish doctor. And in order to save his life, he had to do what the Nazis in Shemam made him do. Right? He had to do it. There was no choice. So if he doesn't go into that building and do whatever they tell him to do, they kill him. I don't know. We should never be in such a situation. So he operated on this woman. And he says he took out my rechem. I can't have children, right? Anyway, so she said, and she hated this doctor. He had a Hebrew name. His name was Shmuel, right? And she hated this doctor. He was worse to her than the Nazis because he was a Jew, and how could he be doing this, right? Anyway, the man insisted. Forget his name. He says, I want to marry you anyway. I love you, I want to marry you. I don't care, you bring me children, you don't bring me children, right? It's like Chana, the story of Chana and Elkanah, right? And I don't care, right? I'm better than 10 children for you, Elkanah says to her. So they got married. They eventually moved to the States. And after a couple of years, she's not feeling 100%. She goes to the doctor, and the doctor runs a bunch of tests, and he says to her, you're pregnant.
Oh.
She's shocked. She says, you're wrong, it can't be, it's impossible. I know what he did to me, right? So the doctor says, look, here's the tests. there's your whatchamacallit, the ultrasound, right? It's there. What are you telling me, right? So you're pregnant. So anyway, it turns out that she really is pregnant. And she finds out the real story. There was something she didn't understand after the doctor in Auschwitz operated on her. He looked at her when he sent her out away, and he said, don't worry, everything is going to be okay. That's what he said to her. Turns out that this doctor, whenever he operated on Jews, right, whenever he had to do whatever, he did an operation that to the Nazis, Imach Shemam, seemed like he was doing what he had to do, but he didn't do what he was really supposed to do, and he saved all of these Jews.
Wow.
Saved all of these Jews, right? The Nazis, by the way, found out, and they killed him. They shot him. They took him out of the building. There's a wall there that you could see, and they killed him. He died al Kiddush Hashem. He died al Kiddush Hashem. She had a baby boy, and she called him Shmuel. She gave him the name Shmuel, right? Unbelievable. In other words, this man that she hated for years and years and years, that she could never ever forgive, she had no idea what he was doing. And how he was saving all of these women. How many children came into the world because of him? And they thought he was a Rasha. And how many children came into the world? Who knows how many other children were called Shmuel? I have no idea, right? How many children were called Shmuel? But when you hear a story like that, you realize the neshama of a Jew. And you realize that the action of this, when anyone who hears this story and hears a story of this doctor who saved hundreds of Jewish women and brought maybe hundreds of Jewish children into the world, and you say that's the neshama of a Jew, that's a Kiddush Hashem. That's a person who he died. By the way, he died. He was Mekadesh Shem Hashem according to the Rambam, right? The Rambam says you have to be willing to die. Right, but he was willing. He was Mikadesh Shem Hashem for Hakadosh Baruch Hu, to make Hakadosh Baruch Hu's. He did it because he was a Jew. That's it. Right? He did it because he understood there's a higher power in the world. There's a higher ethic and morality in the world, and he won't give in to the barbarism that was going on over there. That's a tremendous, tremendous Kiddush Hashem. So anyway, we'll end with that, and we'll all remember that the moment you decide that you want to live a life of Torah, you have to be on your best behavior all the time. How you talk to another person, when you get into an argument with a person, how you get into that argument and how you speak and how respectful you are and all your different midot. It's a huge, huge undertaking. It really is. And you have to feel when you know that you did something that maybe the Torah made HaKadosh Baruch Hu not feel good, right? You have to understand that you have to take responsibility for that, hopefully correct it as well. We should never do it, right? We're only human, right? But this is the tremendous responsibility that we have in the world. So Bezat Hashem, we should all only be Mekadesh Shem Hashem, and we should never be Mechalel Shem Hashem, and we will leave it at that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody on Zoom. I'm glad that we got the Zoom going.